Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension here at UW-Madison. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, Wisconsin Public Television, Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight it's my pleasure to introduce to you Jason Fletcher of the LaFollette School of Public Policy here at UW-Madison. He was born in Athens, Tennessee, and went to high school at Athens, and then he went to the University of Tennessee where he studied econ. He came here for a master's and PhD in agricultural and applied economics, which is a building right through that wall, and then another wall, and then you're in Taylor Hall. Then he went to be on the faculty at Yale University, then he was on the faculty at Columbia University, and in 2013 he returned to UW-Madison to be part of the LaFollette School. Tonight he's talking about something that's pretty important to a lot of us, especially in the DNA field. He's going to be talking about molecular me, exploring the social implications of the Genomics Revolution. Would you please join me in welcoming Jason Fletcher to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Thanks, and thanks to Tom, and thank you all for coming. So tonight I wanted to outline partly some of the advances coming from the genomic revolution, and then really focus in on questions of law, policy, and ethics that are then implicated through these advances, especially honing in on questions of privacy, discrimination, and overall human flourishing that are going to come up. I'll start with a picture of very recent accumulated knowledge. These are our chromosomes with all the almost 90,000 relationships that have been found in the last 15 years between points in our DNA and outcomes of interest, mostly health. So for example, if you zoomed in on this and picked a color, you would find over 1,000 individual locations in the human genome that have been linked to digestive system disease, over 700 to cardiovascular outcomes, and this is all accumulated. This was as of last month. It totals almost 4,000 publications in the last 15 years that are on this one figure. So that's a lot of knowledge there, and what I'm going to do is pivot from a book that a sociologist, Dalton Conley, and economist me wrote a couple years ago to outline the last 15 or 20 years of integration of genetic science and social science. We're both social scientists, although Dalton has a second PhD in biology. And we walk through some of the highs and lows of the last 15 years or so in this integration. And just to fast forward to the end, because this is now a very dated book, even though it was published 2 years ago, in terms of keeping up with the science, I think what you would find is that our quote-unquote future in the title, as part of the title, needs an update, even though it's only a couple years old, and that there's an immense need for policy discussions and implications that were long overdue when we wrote it, and now are even more so. So that's what I'm going to focus a lot of the discussion tonight on. So the book describes the social genomics revolution. I want to start by saying you need a genomics revolution to have social implications. I'm going to describe what we're calling a genomics revolution, what's revolutionary about it. But first, I'll remind you of a few essential facts to then lead us into the findings. One is just a quick refreshment over what a human genome looks like, and in particular, I'll call these letters throughout the talk, but the 3 billion base pairs of nucleotides that make up the human genome, that are about 1.5 billion miles of DNA in your body. And if you took all the letters and made a textbook out of them, and the textbook would be about 65 feet high. So there's a lot of information content in these letters in each of the cells of our body. That's reminder one. Reminder two is that although there's a lot of content, there's quite a lot of similarity across all humans. Over 99.5% of all these letters are the same or identical in all humans. So that points to a lot of common humanity, I think, and similarity across everyone you ever meet. It's also true, so 99.5% or more are identical. It's also true that 98% of all the letters are identical with chimps. So there's also some differences. Some of these letters that are different do matter. That's the second point. And I would have an example of an instance where they matter. So the first row of letters are, if you zero in on chromosome 11 and do a quick read on a small number of letters, that's the top row. You'll see a normal cell reads out C, A, A, and so on. If you go down to the sickle cell, you'll see that all the letters are the same except for one. And so this is an instance in all those 3 billion letters where a single letter difference across humans could have really big implications. So that's point 2. Some letters really matter in explaining difference. And then point 3 is that the letters are permanent in terms of that you had the same letters when you were conceived, you'll have the same letters when you die, approximately. Have a little asterisk there. This is a little bit less true maybe than the other parts because there is mutations over your life, but those are, I'm going to call those minor. I'm simplifying there, but I think for the purposes of most of the policy implications I'm going to describe today, we should think of these as permanent, set in stone when you were conceived, and following you your entire life. It's an approximation of the truth. It's not exactly the truth, but these are the basic facts I want to start out with. So these aren't revolutions themselves; these are reminders. Then I want to describe what the revolutionary part is, because the facts I just outlined are the same today as they were 20 years ago, as they were 100 years ago. So those are the facts. What are the components then that make up a revolution? And that's what I'm going to just take a few minutes time on. So the first component is the technological improvements over the last 10 or 15 years in just measuring human DNA. Okay. So those, and then the third aspect, after you get from facts to the technological improvement, is the use of those improvements in terms of mining very large data sets of human DNA and using advanced statistical methods to then take the DNA to predict outcomes of interest. And what I'm going to describe tonight are some of the policy implications of this revolution. So the first 3 components are the genomics revolution, but then they're going to have implications for social outcomes and policy. So that's what I'm going to be describing tonight. A quick summary of a lot of advancement. I want to first just remind you of just normal life, which is to say that over the last 20 years, some prices of goods that you buy have gone up, some have gone down. Some of those on top are education and healthcare expenses. Those prices have gone up in the last 20 years, and you can see some of these education expenses have more than doubled over, say, 20 years of time. You can also see areas in your life, televisions at the very bottom of this screen, that's a part of your life that is a lot cheaper now for what you're getting than it was 20 years ago. So this is just kind of, recalling that we're all living these lives and we're buying things and these prices change, because I want to remind you that to then make the comparison with what's happened on the DNA side. Okay, so this is normal. This is unprecedented. So this is the cost per human genome since 2001. And what you'll see on the yellow line that is at the bottom, which is pegged to the other unprecedented change in costs, which is computing technology, so this is Moore's law, the green line on top, which is flat. The cost per genome this is the unprecedented part. It's accelerating much faster than even Moore's law, which would be the closest comparator. And so to put so to describe this just a bit more, so in the last 15 years, the cost per human genome has fallen by 100 million times in 15 years. So you can see some of the different projections out on the right-hand side of the graph where, depending on what we believe on future advancements, the cost of sequencing a human genome could go from 100 million or more 10 or 15 years ago to either $100 or $10 or $1, depending on which of the lines you follow. And so this has tremendous implications for data that is then available to analyze. So one implication of these tremendous reductions in costs are companies that where you might send your biological sample, your saliva, and for relatively low cost, direct to consumer, they can genotype you as a human being at relatively low cost. And these are some figures I have up here for a few of the private companies that you're probably familiar with, and approximately some figures on their growth and how many people are in their data sets from 2015, 2016, 2017, and a few months ago. So you see 5 million plus in 23andMe, 7 million plus from last year at Ancestry DNA. Family Tree a couple of years ago was closing in on 1 million. If you add those three private companies together, you get about 1 in 20 of the U.S. population. And this is a shift also just as a larger point to make from scientific analysis of data to private companies. Scientific meaning, I mean by that a place like University of Wisconsin who might analyze a lot of human genetic data, which is true, to private companies that have now 5-7 millions of individual human genetic samples. And just as a point I'll come back to is the expansion. Just so example, you see under the Ancestry DNA, there was a sale after Thanksgiving in 2017, and they received 1.5 million genetic tests over the weekend. And you can do that because it's so cheap, as the previous slide. So 1.5 million saliva samples is about 2,000 gallons of saliva. It's about the size of a modest above ground pool. And the future's hard to predict. Here's a couple tries at predicting how many human genomes will likely be analyzed in the coming years. So there's different versions depending on the red, the orange, or the blue projections. But the most conservative estimate is by 2025 we have over 100 million human samples analyzed. So this is a huge expansion in data. This is big data. And I'll be turning in a minute to the use of this data. I just want to fill out the picture of who's collecting the data. So you have the private companies, 23andMe, Ancestry DNA, and so on. But there's a lot of government efforts also across the world in amassing relatively large, in the hundreds of thousands, samples of human DNA. Here's a small list of examples and when some of the enrollments began. So you see Iceland way ahead. And that whole country is now in one data set, and so on. And in a couple examples from a little bit over a year ago, where Finland had a relatively large government program, 500,000 people was their target enrollment. New South Wales, 3 million people was their target. So many of you probably have seen something about the U.S. version of this, which is meant to collect 1 million U.S. Data points. Just to remind you, 1 million, that was what Ancestry DNA got over a weekend in Thanksgiving, right? Just thinking about scale of what this collection is versus some of the other data collections. So this is the government version. So that's a quick summary of the technological improvements. So huge, unprecedented reductions in the costs. That leads to a lot of access, a lot of availability of, at very low cost, sequencing a lot of people. Okay, so that's part one. And then there's part two. What are we as governments, private companies, clinicians going to do with all this data? And that's where statistical improvements and predictive analysis is going to come in. So I'm going to outline, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the first figure that I put up, where there was 90,000 associations discovered in the human genome that linked specific locations in the genome with outcomes. So what's behind that? What's the machinery behind that? I'm going to spend a couple slides on that, of what are we doing with the data. And that is with the purpose of having some predictive capacity, mostly in the health arena, but not only in health outcomes. So that's what I want to describe. So that the first figure, and you see the chromosomes from before without all the dots next to them. All of those studies are based on a way of examining relatively large data sets of human DNA called Genomewide association studies, which is to say the steps are you get a big data set of many people, and each of those people, as you recall, have 3 million letters in their base pairs in their DNA, and you just point by point scan through the whole data set of up to 3 billion and ask where in that data set do I find differences among people that are associated in a statistical sense with outcomes that differ. And that's where this last point is that you're scanning across all the genome, and so that scan can be in the tens of thousands of analyses up to tens of millions or more analyses in each of these genome-wide association studies. So the picture version of this is that once you do these scans, you have 10 million results. And then you're going to want to visualize all those results in some way to ask, is there anything in the DNA that I'm finding that seems to be related to my outcome of interest? And the outcome of interest could be cardiovascular disease, or it could be height, or it could be any number of outcomes. So that's the left-hand side, is that there's going to be a scan of the whole genome, and some places you might find hits or associations, and then you're going to take in some way, and I'll describe what this some way is in a moment, in some way you're going to take the information you've just found and try to use it to predict outcomes of people. So those are the two steps. So I'm going to go in a little bit more detail now of just some clarifying examples, I think. So here's an outcome. It's not height. This outcome is the inability to smell the distinct odor produced in urine after eating asparagus. So that's an outcome. It's a yes or no outcome. And a genome-wide association study would go point by point across all those chromosomes that are differentially colored. And what you'll see is that this analysis found nothing except one place. And that one place is that huge spike of association. So all the other areas, there was no relationship between what letter you carried and this ability. But in one place in the genome, there was a huge signal, and you see that here. And this is called a Manhattan plot. You're looking for tall buildings in Manhattan plots. That means that you might have found a genetic hotspot that is associated with your outcome. So this is a very easy answer. There's one place, and there's no other places in the genome that seem to be related to this outcome. Here are a little bit more complicated, genetically complicated outcomes. So these are in the food allergy domain. Upper left is any food allergy among peanut, egg, and milk. And then the other figures show separately peanut in upper right, egg in lower left, cow's milk in lower right. And what you'll see is you do see some tall buildings again, but you don't see a single tall building. You see, in some cases, a single tall building with other medium-sized buildings, and in some cases you say maybe many medium-sized buildings. So this, you might, after running this scan across a whole genome and finding a lot of hits, not just one, you might say that this is a little bit more complicated genetically, but it still has some genetic basis, these different food allergy outcomes. And so this is the basis of those 90,000 hits that I described in the very beginning. Each of them comes from something like this, where you scan the genomes of hundreds of thousands of people or more, and you do that hundreds of thousands or millions of times. And in a lot of places you find nothing, and in some places you find something. And this is a figure of this type of analysis over the last 15 years. And what you see is that there was nothing until about 2006. And since about 2006 to the present day, there's been closing in on 4,000 of these studies. And over those 4,000 studies, that all of them will have a picture like this in there. They have found that over these accumulated 4,000 studies, over the last 10 years, have found over 90,000 places that look like this in the outcome. And that level of analysis is about one per day. You'll get one of these per day. So a couple days ago, here's like a one of these. This is for knee pain. So you take 200,000 people, you run 1 million tests across the genome. In a lot of places, you have not very large buildings. Those will be places that don't seem to be associated with reports of knee pain. In some areas, like on the very left, you see this higher building, and that might be a place that you might then go investigate further what it is about this area in the genome that seems to be associated with knee pain. I just pulled this up because this was a couple weeks ago, but every week you would be able to get a picture like this from a Genome-wide association consortium of some sort. Okay, so that's the Genome-wide association studies. And then, like I said, a picture like this, you might want to take the information you're learning and summarize it in some way for prediction. And that idea and that use of these results are called creating a polygenic score, polygenic mini genes score, which is like a credit card score, credit score, which is amassing a lot of information about you and your patterns of buying and whether you're late on payments and so on, and creating one number. This is the genetic version of this. It's looking across the whole genome and saying, well, you have some knee pain letters over here, and you have none over here, but you have these big ones over on the right-hand side, and you sum it all up, and some people are going to be high knee pain genetic load, and some people are going to be low knee pain genetic load, and it will look like on the lower right, and often these are normally distributed in the end, where like I said, some people have high genetic risk and some people have very low genetic risk. And then finally, you have this predictive measure that you can take to the clinic. And when you bring someone in to an office visit, you have the lower left-hand side, which is that you can assess this with, like I said, a very cheap genetic saliva sample that will cost, maybe right now it's $100 to do. And then potentially, you at least have the option from the clinical side to make decisions based on that genetic analysis. And so in this case, you might have people with high risk for cardiovascular disease that you treat differently in the clinic than people with low genetic risk of cardiovascular disease. So are we comfortable with that so far? Genome-wide association studies, hits, no hits, places in the genome that have tall buildings, taking that, then amassing that information like this for knee pain and smushing it all together to create one score. And some people are going to be high on that score and some people low on that score. So that's all okay so far? Okay, so let's move to social genomics. So everything I just said, you can do with not just knee pain. You can do with how far in school did you go. And here's what that looks like 2 years ago. This was in 2016, this study. So it's essentially the knee pain study, but instead of knee, it's how far did you go to college. And this study found 74 locations in the genome where if you have an A versus a T, a C versus a G, you're more likely to go farther in school. So this is an example of a complex trait, how far in school you go, that has potentially some underlying genetic predispositions for it. And if you're comfortable with the machinery so far, where you're looking at a Manhattan plot and you're looking for buildings, it's the same machinery here. You're scanning the whole genome, looking for places where differences in genetic, these letters are related to this outcome. This outcome is years of schooling instead of knee pain. So this was way back in 2016, right? So whatever discussions that we'll have in a minute, I'm just highlighting that they probably should have happened many years ago. This is now dated. The new version of this came out, so this was, the one I just described was from 300,000 people. Now it's over 1 million people. And instead of 74 locations in the genome, they're at over 1,200 locations in the genome. So here's the Manhattan plot for, again, how far in school did you go. And the same next step is possible here, which is to create predictive polygenic scores for how far in school people go. And what's interesting here, in addition, is that instead of the clinician's office being the next slide is you can upload your DNA to the internet, in this website in particular, and without a clinician's oversight, you can get your polygenic scores back to you for years of schooling. So now it's both an expansion of the traits of potential interest from knee and urine in asparagus and so on, health-related cardiovascular disease, to much broader outcomes. And there's no need to consult a doctor in any of this. So that suggests, and as you might already anticipate, a lot of companies can come in and fill in gaps of potential interest. So here's one that's on the health side. No need for a physician here. There's a company for $199 that if you send in a saliva sample, they'll send you back breast cancer risk. No need for any visit to the doctor. There's broader companies that, same thing, if you'd like to send them your DNA, they'll send you back, they'll quote, unlock insights about health, fitness, even the wine you might prefer. Here's another one from just a few months ago. This is the Spotify, the music service, will create music playlists for you based on your DNA. So it's expanding. So let's roll back to some a little bit more serious questions about potential policy impact. So the themes here are expansion of these large-scale genome-wide association studies into not narrow health outcomes, but both broad health outcomes, but also into social domains like years of schooling. And there's a decentralization of knowledge, meaning that there's not a gatekeeper called your clinician that is the only person you can get this information from. There's direct lines to direct-to-consumer companies that can provide whatever it is that you want in terms of predicting in terms of predicting outcomes based on your genetic information. And I think one policy implication that will be a major theme here is that this allows a lot of new directions in discriminating against people or for people based on their genotype. That 10 years ago, 15 years ago was just not allowed because the technology was not there. It was not cheap to sequence human DNA 20 years ago. We did not have all these Manhattan plots to examine 15, 20 years ago. Now we do, so those technological barriers have been moved, and there's no barriers in terms of having to interact with the medical establishment. Now, I think there's more serious questions about what areas of our life would we like to be discriminated for or against based on our DNA. Let me give you some examples. So it's I think a good idea maybe to start from the very small area in our life that you cannot be discriminated against based on with your genetics, which is health insurers now in the U.S. cannot legally discriminate against you or for you, for that matter, based on your genetics. So this is the Geno law from 2008. Employers cannot discriminate against you based on your genetics. There's no rest of that sentence. There's no other areas in our life that I would start filling in that cannot discriminate against you based on your genetics. So that opens the question, do we want to fill in any other areas in our life where we do not want to be discriminated for or against based on your genetic code? And I also, so I'll come back to this. And then obviously, as this information proliferates, there's other areas in our life that we might not have first thought would be areas of genetic discrimination that may be. So my co-author wrote this middle column in 2017 speculating, well, what would happen if 23andMe, which is a consumer DNA company, merged with online dating companies? And do we want that? Do we want to make that illegal or not? So of course that was way back in 2017 where he speculated. So of course that's a long time ago versus now, which is of course that's exactly what is available now, which is companies that want to are advertising matching you with a partner based on your genotype. So that's one area we can be for or against. The use of genetics to discriminate either for or against you. Just as an example, there are areas in your genome that put you at much higher risk for Alzheimer's disease. As a 20-year-old, would you like that in your matching profile? And then the third area is maybe even the larger set of concerns, which is just this leading question of what else might we want to predict, not just about health outcomes that your health insurer might like to know or your employer might like to know, but what about in our personal lives might we like to have more information about? And that's getting back to this first point, that the same genetic code you had in your fetus you have now. So what might we want to predict about a fetus or a baby? So sex, eye color is very straightforward, hair color, quite straightforward, height, quite straightforward. Even maybe bigger domains that are a little bit more squishy, like athleticism, is predictable. IQ, predictable based on genetic information. Even something like facial features. You might think, well, never could do that. I'll show you that we did that people did that 2 years ago. But the question I'm raising now is, what would we like to be available to be predicted and given, and what information would we like to be sent to parents of either a pregnant woman or someone who just had their baby? When you have the baby with the heel prick in the hospital, would you like to have a genetic readout of all these things? Because it's cheap. It's not because we don't do that now because we can't technologically. We can technologically. The question is, do we want to make any of these things off limits or not? And would we ever want to do that? So there's one long held interest of predicting children's characteristics. This is coming from 1939. Dr. Seuss had a patent for this device, which served the purpose of predicting the facial features of their children. So you take a picture of both of the couple, you overlay them, and then you give the parents, that's what your kid's going to look like. So this one failed, right? It was not accurate. But we've changed the technology such that there's a possibility to provide potential parents a different view that's not from these overlapping pictures. As I mentioned a minute ago, so this is 2 years ago. This is a study in a scientific journal that used genetic information only to create computerized images of people's faces and then compare those to their actual faces. And here's what so one row is only based on A's and C's and T's and G's of people's genetic code, and the other row is their actual faces. And I'll remind you that these A's and C's and T's and G's are those letters that you had as a fetus. So when you ask, would we ever be able to predict or make predictions to parents about what their kids are going to look like? We could 2 years ago. And facial features won't obviously be the only thing that parents might care about. And there's already an avenue that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with of examining very early in embryonic life potential genetic conditions where you might want to not implant embryo, for example, because there's some maybe severe genetic condition. The same tools that one would use to genotype in day 3 a cell from an embryo are those tools, and get the A's and C's and T's and G's, elicit those from the cell, are the same. That's the same information one could get then to ask, well, what's that cell going to look like if allowed to develop? And the issue to restate here is that there's essentially no legal limits in what information can be assessed in these early days. Should there be? That's going to be, I think, the question to consider further. And then directionally, I don't think we've stopped at being. I don't think we're at the frontier of prediction and of large data sets. And in fact, the future is much larger capacity. Directionally, the capacity is going to be to make better predictions, more accurate predictions in any of the outcomes I just described. Example is the education one that I showed earlier, where in 2 years. This is the first picture I showed you. There was 74 different findings. 2 years later, tripling the sample size, there were 1,200 findings. This is the direction that many outcomes are going. Is higher accuracy, larger data sets, and that then allows increases, directionally against increases in discrimination opportunities, both for and against people. The set of outcomes are expanding. You know, the domain over which you would like to discriminate is expanding, it's not contracting. The possibility of private data becoming public, another possibility maybe is understating the very high likelihood that private data becomes public, and then just ethical and legal and policy discussions around some of our comfort with precision medicine, which is to say precision medicine is part of using genetic information from a patient to make practice calls of which treatment you might assign an individual or what course of therapy you might assign. What the same technology could be used to, the same steps could be used for withholding or not withholding policies, interventions that are outside the clinic. What sets of laws and discussions might we want to have for those? So let me outline a couple recent events, some of them even a little dated, that I think maybe further concentrate our minds on the policy, legal, and ethical questions here. And I'll focus a little bit on privacy because you all know that there's been massive data breaches in the last few years. One from credit card companies, that seems terrible, with severe implications of those that have had their data stolen. But the point here is that there's an escalation with a breach of DNA data, which is to say, when you release someone's social security number and their driver's license information and their address, that has some potential negative implications for that person. But what you're releasing in general are attributes of a person they can change. One, most of those things, your name, your address, even your social security number, your driver's license, most of those things you can actually change. And more important, most of those elements are not very predictive about you and your Alzheimer's risk. DNA, if it's released to the public, your DNA, if it's released to the public, is predictive and it's permanent. Right, so it doesn't have the features of a credit card hack so much. It has something that's much scarier, actually. Releasing your own Alzheimer's risk is not something that you can change, and it is predictive of your future outcomes. Another subset of this privacy concern is how to think about and how to deal with personal decisions people make to contribute their DNA and the implications to their biological family members of that decision. When you contribute your DNA, that information is also informative about your biological children, your biological parents, your other biological relatives in their own Alzheimer's risk or their own other, even their any risk related to genetic information. Here's a recent report from the journal Science from just a few months ago. The main part is the last line, which is the technique they're using that on one hand is used to capture serial killers from 30 years ago, which is to find not the serial killer's DNA in a database, but the third cousin of the serial killer's DNA in the database, and then find that serial killer through that familial search. But what this paper is describing is because there's so much DNA out there already, they're talking about 1.3 million individuals that they had public access to their DNA, that the technique that they're using through familial searches, the last line, could find nearly any U.S. individual of European descent in the near future in the U.S. Because we're all related. And you only need your third cousin in this data set for you to be partially in the data set is the point. And this is, again, directionally is going to get worse, not better, as these data sets get bigger and bigger. So we need to make proactive decisions about how these data can and cannot be used. Going back to the two areas in our lives where our data cannot be used against us, health insurance and employers, I'll just remind you that several times in the last 2 years, this law was almost eliminated. So in a year and a half ago, one of the repeal and replace efforts of the ACA, part of that act was to eliminate part of GINA. So meaning that it's a fragile law, that one And this is one of those cases where it lost by one vote. One vote one way or the other, and we no longer have protection from health insurers or our employers in discriminating using genetic information to discriminate against employees or patients. Another kind of end around the protections we have are employee. So this is from just I guess now almost a year. Employees being offered free genetic testing from their employers. So it's not right. And then what happens then is that the employers don't have you as a specific employee's genetic data, but they have the aggregate of all their employees to make decisions. So again, it's a little bit of a funneling away of some of the protections. And the question I think on the table is whether we want to increase protections or reduce protections. And in what areas of our lives do we want to increase protections or reduce protections? On the child side or on the fetal set of questions of what information you would want about your child, a new DNA test, now this is new being a year ago, is with no interaction with with your doctor. This is $650. You can get, direct to consumer, a readout of 190 diseases in a newborn's genetic code. So some of these larger questions are on privacy, about what framework we want to have guiding who owns the DNA that you contribute, and how, as I brought up a minute ago, how to weigh individuals' interests in getting their ancestry reports or getting their reports on their health risk versus the information that they're contributing about their biological family members. We have other questions that are on the table about who has access to these technologies. So in England, there's a recent effort by their national health system to provide free genetic testing to anyone who wants it. The caveat being that if you say yes, then you give your data away to the national health system. But that's the trade-off. Anyone in the country can have a free genetic test, a free human sequence, a genomic sequence, but the trade-off is you're providing that data to the national health system. Representation, that's a much longer conversation. I'll just start it by saying that people from 3 countries have contributed, are behind over 70% of all genetic findings. I wonder if you could think about what those 3 countries might be. So the US, UK, and I thought the one I was going to get you with is Iceland. Iceland, that tiny little island of 300,000 people, is one of the main contributors of all the knowledge of genetics, of human genetics we know, because the whole country has been sequenced. It's in single data set, and it's underneath a lot of these genome-wide association studies. So that is to say that over 80% of all of the people who are in all these studies are of European ancestry. There's very limited representation of any other ancestral group. Discrimination, what interactions would we like protected? So the first line is what our current protections are, health insurance and employers. And the other ones are just, you can have a long list of where you might like protections or might not like protections. Schools, that's K through 12, universities, would we like admission decisions partly based on genetics? Criminal justice, long-term care insurance is not part of health insurance protections. Long-term care providers can discriminate against you based on your genetics. Car insurers could, and so on. So that could be a much longer sentence. Even in clinical decisions, how comfortable are we with allowing clinical decisions based on genetics? That is, how comfortable are we with precision medicine in general? And to the extent we are comfortable with that, are we also comfortable with the same kind of analysis done for other interventions, like educational interventions in schools? Where would we draw the line? So these are all open questions. And then what information should we shield or allow to parents, potential parents, about the genetic status of their embryo? So we have a limited amount of information that can be shared now, maybe about Down syndrome, about a certain narrow set of genetic conditions, but there's no law now that says that a provider couldn't also provide genetic predictions of a fetus's IQ. Wisconsin is leading the way in some of these questions. We were one of 6 clusters at the university level that were approved to bring in new faculty from the central campus, from the provost office, and from WARF, actually, to become a hub of interest with new faculty that will work with some of the ones who I've listed here who are current faculty on some of these questions. So I think that's at least a good direction for the university to be supporting. And I'll conclude by acknowledging some of the financial support I've received for some of this research, and I'm very appreciative of, and give you some of my information for follow-ups, and then open it up for Q&A. Yes?
If the genome predicts whether you're allergic to eggs, and the genome doesn't change, why can you outgrow your allergy?
So the question is about outgrowing allergies for people who have, so the point is, so genetics predicts whether or not you're allergic to eggs. Some people outgrow it. How could that be? So like most of the outcomes that you can imagine, probably everything you can imagine, the outcome of interest is a mix of genetics and environment, and the interactions of genetics and environment. And so one typical explanation for changes, because it's not genetic changes, as you said, over someone's life, would be environmental changes. Part of that could be developmental changes that happen in all of us in normal development that remove particular allergies as being a source of problem. But it could be, some people would be a change in environment. Environment is very broad. It would be non-genetic changes. It could be a change in diet, it could be a change in location, and it could be a change in your microbiome that is allowing you to digest without problem items that you didn't have to before. So the larger point, though, which is an important one, is that this is not a DNA is destiny talk. It's that DNA is predictive. And what are we going to?
Someone is allergic to eggs, clearly, highly allergic to eggs, and 5 years later is not.
Yes.
Well, when you go to the allergist, what they do is they hyperstimulate and they literally burn out the records.
Well, I just know my daughter was highly allergic to eggs, extremely sensitive.
Yes.
And at that time, 37 years ago, the allergy view was if you can avoid what you're allergic to, you're much more likely to outgrow it. And she avoided eggs, and after 5 or 6 years, she was not allergic to them anymore.
I think an implication of that, which is not surprising, which is that allergies is not 100% determined by genes. There are some conditions that are 100% determined by genes. You could think of Huntington's disease as a disease that is conditioned on a very small amount of variation in the human genome. And if you have that variation, the likelihood you have Huntington's is near 100%. And if you don't, it's 0%. That's the exception to the rule. Most of the other health outcomes we're thinking of are a combination of genetics as a predisposing factor, but also a factor that works with or against environmental conditions. So that's, I think, the explanation of why most of the outcomes you might think of could have this feature, where that in some times of your life you might be, you might have it, and then others you don't. It's another way of saying that it's not purely genetic, because genetics wouldn't have changed through your whole life. Yes.
Well, maybe what I'm wondering is if maybe it's not a full understanding of what genetics means. That maybe just the genetics means that you might be allergic. You have this sensitivity and are allergic at some point, but that doesn't mean, even though your genetics hasn't changed, that you can't outgrow it.
Right. But I would call that a gene-environment interaction. That the genetics give you a sensitivity, and you're sensitive in some environments and not in others. And part of this environmental thing is that your body changes over time, and that's your environment. Or it could be your diet changed over time. But the point there is that your daughter would have some genetic prediction of allergy, right? But it would not be determinant. It would not be the only factor. And none of like your credit score, these are not perfectly predictive of all your future. They're just like your credit score are assigning you values of high likelihood of default or not, but people who have high likelihood of default or high likelihood of allergies genetically don't have allergies. And the same is true for people who have low genetic likelihood of allergies. Some of them do have allergies. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was just thinking about like people that have maybe like what I would call behavioral disorders or something like that. Obviously, you could predict something like Alzheimer's, but what about like bipolar disorder or somebody has some other types of things like that?
Mm-hmm.
Can the genome predict that as well?
Yes, but not so the same with allergies is that you could generate this credit score for bipolar, and in general, people that have the higher credit score, the high polygenic score for bipolar, are more likely to have bipolar, and people who have less are less. But I'm really restate this is a little bit. I mean, just put it in a different context. If I told you that family history predicts things like bipolar, I think many people have heard that, and some people think it's true also. That's another way of saying that genetics is one factor of these outcomes. Not everyone whose parent had bipolar will have bipolar. Some people will be the first case in their family. Right, so it's not a perfect prediction. But in general, if you take children of people with bipolar and children whose parents don't have bipolar, the children of people with bipolar are going to be higher risk of developing bipolar themselves, but it's not 100%.
Or what about something like addiction?
Yep, same thing.
Same thing?
Yep.
Really?
The assumption, though, if you assume it's 1 point mutation, that these are fault defect. In the case of bipolar, I think you've got 80 known factors.
Right. So that's where this is where this credit score comes in, which is that you're just placing people on a continuum of genetic risk, because most outcomes are not single factorial. They're not the asparagus picture from before, right? That's the exception. Most of them look more like allergies and look more like cardiovascular illness, where it's all over, or the knee pain one that I showed, where there's peaks in a lot of the genome. So those are complex traits. They're complex genetic traits, and their predictions would be polygenic. Many genes would together go into this prediction. Yes?
Isn't there a danger that environment actually works its way back in here? If your parents had a good education, you have their genes, and you're more likely to have good education.
Yes.
So that confounds what the genetic data is telling you, I think.
So the question is, how do you separate your genes from your parents' genes in the environments that your parents' genes raised you in? Great question. I mean, it's a very it's a question that's moving towards, are you getting cause and effect answers here, or are you not able to unpack the fact that people in certain families do better and people in other families don't? So I will say, in the defense of these credit scores, in the defense of the polygenic scores, they work when you compare biological siblings to one another. So by the genetic lottery, some children with the same parents, 2 children, some of them will be higher on this credit score in education than others. And the child in pairs of biological children, the child with higher polygenic score for education goes to school longer in these data sets. It's actually the figure I showed you underneath the 200-page appendix of the science paper is that analysis, is studies of siblings, biological siblings, asking the question, siblings raised in the same family where one had the higher polygenic score, is it actually true statistically that they go to school longer? And the answer is yes. That's still not definitive, but it's a partial answer to your question of how much you can say is the genes themselves versus the environment that your parents who had similar genes to you raised you in? It's a very good question.
On the chromosomal level, like Klinefelter syndrome, the biggest predictor of criminality that we have is the more X chromosomes you have, the more likely you are to be criminal.
I'll make a prediction here, though, that so the point in the audience was the current findings on criminality are about chromosomal differences across people. I have a prediction here. If I came back next year, I bet it's not going to be the case any longer. That I bet what's going to happen is that these polygenic scores are going to outperform because these polygenic scores are available in millions of people of the full population. And they're going to so they're going to be representative of many people, not just people who differ on these chromosomal abnormalities. So that's a prediction.
The flaw of the science you picked out exactly. You're going from a small number of known cases.
Yes.
And on the other end, you have a large amount of data playing its way out.
And that's really, so the point is, genetics, if you think about 30 years ago or longer, was small numbers of people, often family study, family studies of cases and probands across between small numbers of family. This is just a major change when you think about the educational Genomewide association study I gave you of 1.1 million people were underneath that analysis across 70 different data sets in much of the European Western world. So it's just a very different style and analysis, and it's just the whole thing's different in the back.
So your education gene study, do you include in that database adoptions or different economic opportunities of the same genetic base?
So the question I heard was about first adoption, but then the second one I didn't get.
Well, to include the null hypothesis of the same genes, one in an economically upward mobile family versus being not having those opportunities, compare those as a null hypothesis.
Okay, so I think I heard two. One is a question of what about adopted children. I think in general, these data sets do not focus on adopted children. I think as another prediction, I think that's going to be a path forward. Really, to answer your question earlier about delinking the genetics of a parent to a child, one way of doing it is focusing on adopted households. But to your broader question about how particular these polygenic scores are to specific populations that have different institutional backgrounds. We're talking about years of schooling. We all know that it wasn't so long ago that many institutions of higher education in this country did not allow women. That would change this type of analysis, right? Because the genes that would be predictive of going to college could not be in a place where someone cannot go to college. But the analysis underneath these large-scale data sets are going to be pooling together all the different institutions of higher education, or the institutional structures of higher education, with the caveat of that it's rich Western countries. I already described that almost all the data in the world that's currently being analyzed on human genetics is of European ancestry individuals. In the 80+% of all the data that's ever been analyzed is on individuals of European ancestry. So that is the context that these are relevant for. And in particular, the people who make these credit scores, these polygenic scores, explicitly ask or dictate that no one use these scores in populations that the scores were not trained on. Thus, you should not be using polygenic scores for education in an African American population. That's explicit in these data sets because it's mostly what you're asking about. What about the context of interest and how those results port over or do not port over to other contexts? So that's at least in people's minds. It's not resolved because of this point of there not being data yet that's sufficiently sized of people who are not who do not have European ancestry. Yes.
Has Iceland or any of the European countries developed any kind of legal structure around how their countries are using the genome data that they're collecting? Or by any chance are any of these countries in Europe or Iceland kind of leading the charge on how best to develop the legalese around all this?
The question is about differences across countries and contexts about the legal structures around human genetic information. But I think you're partly asking just a data question about science and sharing of data, but also a larger question about the legal structures, about how that data can feed back into populations across the world. So for example, if a team makes a discovery that a certain individual in their data is at high risk of something, do they report those findings back? And the answer to that really depends on the context. And your question about leading the charge, it's a great question. I mean, it strikes me of how to decide who the leader is, which direction they should be going to say that that's a leader in the right direction. Right? I presume you mean by protecting the subjects.
Yeah, to prevent this discrimination and prevent healthcare companies from, not covering you or whatever. Yeah, or insurance companies not covering you. Yeah, just protecting against bad actors, I guess.
Yeah, so I don't have a country in mind because the result. So the thing is, the results from the education study, at least from the study's author's point of view, could be used on anybody in the world who's of European ancestry to discriminate or not. So it's really an individual country level legal structure of in what ways can genetics be used for or against people. And on one hand, you think about precision medicine having a lot of potential benefits where some drugs might be particularly good for people with certain genotypes, and we might want to do that. But that is exactly genetic discrimination. Withholding or not withholding drugs based on your genotype is exactly that. And I think most of the people I talk to are more comfortable with that precision medicine use of genetic information, but then not so much of other uses. But we haven't really drawn these lines of where we would prefer to be discriminated for or against in what parts of our life, like the clinician's office, or where we would not like to when we're dealing with our health insurer. So those are some of the few instances where there's some clarity in the United States. As you know, health insurance is so unique to the U.S. Versus a lot of these other countries where they just don't have anything like our system. So some of those issues are not really on the table so much about being priced out of your health insurance because of your genetic code, because there are not those institutions in other countries. But the whole list of criminal justice, schools, other types of insurance, I know of very few or no examples of this leading the charge you're describing. In the back?
If you comment, I wanted to comment on the fact that Iceland is somewhat atypical, is that they have a problem of inbreeding, and so that stakeholder of healthcare, of their population, drove them to be the genetic leader just to protect their population.
So the comment is that Iceland is so specific, partly because their history of being almost a founder community of most people in Iceland are related to most other people in Iceland, I think is a short version of your point. And that there are there's some benefits of knowing the genetics of the people around you when making family decisions and so on. So I won't comment more to say it's a very special case, except to restate how oversized Iceland is in genetic analysis. It's one of the top 3 countries, as I said, providing all that's underneath all these analyses of relationships between particular parts of our genetic code and outcomes come from this unique country. So totally agree with your point. Tom, what was are you pointing me to someone, or are you giving me a time?
No, I was going to raise a question, but there are other people, but I'll go ahead. We had a person here from all of us a couple months ago, and she assured us that they had an ironclad exemption from any say that there's not some way that the supposedly ironclad guarantee that you can't get a judge to order that to be broken. What's the status of that? I mean, I was very disturbed by the family tree announcement that they're cooperating with the FBI. It's like a front or something. That's bizarre that you could give your DNA and thereby incriminate anybody in your family.
So the question is on the All of Us initiative here, which is, I think they did a lot of hard thinking about protecting the people who contribute directly to the 1 million person study. And I mean, I'd be happy just for today to say, let's assume that is everything's perfect about that arrangement, that people who contribute to that one study, the 1 million people, are forever protected from that contribution directly coming back to them in a negative way. The problem, in some sense, is that what I'm describing with these polygenic scores and the use of them have nothing to do with all of us as a data collection. You do not have to be in any data set that, like all of us, for this to be affecting you later. Meaning that if you ever contribute any biological specimen to your hospital or clinician or anything like that, that's where, or anywhere, or if your brother, especially if it's your twin brother, contributes to some place that's not all of us but is somewhere else, you're along for that ride. But going back to these big policy questions, if we're setting up a society where employers could not make you but ask you to contribute your DNA to receive goodies, that's nothing to do with all of us, but the employers would be using the outcomes, the analysis of a place like All of Us that links genetics with depression, taking that away from All of Us, getting those polygenic scores, and then using those in their hiring decisions. You could never have been involved with All of Us, and it could still affect you later. So I just want to separate. There's two questions of you contributing to probably a very good enterprise called All of Us that's going to enhance science, versus these other implications of what areas of our lives do we want to allow versus disallow the use of our genetic data in decision making. So I don't know if that's too broad or not. I want to just put on the off. If we even say All of Us is perfect, everything about it is great, I don't think it actually eliminates much of what I was describing today about policy and legal questions, because the information from a place like All of Us can be separated from that particular data set, just as the 1.1 million people who were underneath that education study I showed. None of you probably contributed to that analysis if you're not in 23andMe, or if you're not in Iceland. You probably weren't a person in that data set, but that polygenic score can then be ported out to affect any of us. It could still be used for analyzing the genetic prediction of your grandchild without you ever having contributed to the education score yourself. Yeah. Sorry, you were in line. Quick question.
When we look at big data, and publicly the Chinese are leading predictive behavior, and they're actually arguing that they can come up with something better than democracy, just like you just by looking at predictive behavior through generalized artificial intelligence. And they've shown, at least published stuff from the Chinese, shows they can predict where somebody is going to be at. They can predict what train they're going to take. And this is just an instance. If you take these two technologies, these are just two early baby embryonic technologies, which you can literally assume that within some time, you'll pretty much be able to predict most anything about most anybody, anytime, anywhere, any place.
So that's without, I mean, underneath the point about predicting outcomes, choices like what train you get on and what building you go in to, I think underneath what you're describing is some claim about accuracy being very high. Like being able to predict, you can predict a lot of things with low accuracy. You can still say I'm predicting that, but the accuracy is low. And we want to keep that in mind here, is that all the outcomes I did describe as predictable, they're certainly better than chance, but we do want to remind ourselves that there are a lot of outcomes that are both genetic and environmental, but the genetic component is relatively small. I mean, the estimates of the genetic component in years of schooling is something like 30% out of 100% of all the variation might be genetic. So that leaves a lot of not genetic predictors. So you can both predict it, right, and you will be better than chance in your accuracy, and the accuracy is going to get better, but there are some upper limits probably on some outcomes that we really care about. I mean, it might be that we care more about schooling than what building you're going to go into, and there are differences of, genetics are permanent. There's an issue that you predict what building someone's going to go to, and then they move cities, and then where's your accuracy is not so good. But I take your point of the future here, and it's like most of the topics I described today, it's not the future, it's the past, which is to use AI to make better predictions. That's already underneath some of this. That's definitely right. But I want to come to the point. There are upper limits to some of these predictions. The upper limit here is not that we're going to predict with 100% accuracy 100% of everyone's years of schooling. There are upper limits to that because environment matters in many outcomes. Not every outcome, but it matters in many outcomes.
That's a point I'm just thinking in terms of heritability issues, and with regard to this particular gene or this particular set will be accurate under these environmental conditions, and if you change the environment, everything changes.
Right.
So the question becomes the misuse of all this, because it's sounding as though when you look at these predictive values, people are taking them as though they are, in fact, your life is predetermined. There's a predetermination here, when in fact it still remains substantially random. Mm-hmm. And by using this information in this way is simply false. That is, it's not what these correlations or connections predict. I mean, to call it a prediction is kind of gray to me. It's not a prediction of anything. It's just a...
Well, so I guess I mostly agree with you, but let me outline some of the disagreements. Which is to say, if you were right, like 100% right, so the point being that these don't predict anything, they're not, and so on, then we don't actually have a problem, mostly because they're not going to be useful forever. Like any time that a company comes in and says, "Here's your prediction," they're always going to be wrong. That solves its own problem. If we think that the problem is that these are going to be used, and we really care, I think, that they're going to be used because they're accurate, and we don't like being discriminated against based on genetics. If they were inaccurate, it would be the same thing as just someone flipping a coin, and based on a heads, this is what we're going to do to you. I think it's very different. So, of course, those are the extreme cases. We're somewhere in the middle where they do have some predictive accuracy. This last years of schooling paper showed that if you were in the upper 20% of polygenic scores for education, your likelihood of going to college was 4 times as high as if you were in the lowest 20%. Right. So it's on one hand. So it's not. They do not say anywhere that they have anything close to 100% accuracy in predicting whether you go to college just on your genotype. But it's also true that it's not just noise everywhere, and there's no predictive power, there's no predictive accuracy because of what I just described. That using only genetics, people that they classify as high risk for college are indeed 4 times more likely to go to college than those who they classify as less likely to go to college based only on A's and C's and T's and G's. So somewhere in the middle where there is information here, it's not deterministic, it's not stealing your future, but the question is, how do we want it used in making decisions about you? I think that's and I'm not going to then have an answer for you. I think this is a question that's in front of us of how, in what areas of our life do we want it used? And the answer could be nowhere, never. It could be eliminate precision medicine. I want nothing about my life to be dictated because someone knows this letter about me, and make that illegal. So it's basically take GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, and say everything, not just health insurance and employment, everything, right? Yes?
Have insurance companies dealt with the issue of it? Let's say you do the breast cancer thing, and I don't know how accurate this is. Does it tell you you're 10 times more likely than someone without this is to have breast cancer? So if I get a result that says I'm 10 times more likely to have breast cancer, does my insurance company have to pay for a prophylactic surgery?
Your health insurer cannot discriminate against you, meaning they can't not cover you or charge you a different price, but it doesn't change.
But that doesn't mean they have to pay. That doesn't mean they have to pay for something to a surgery.
They treat you no differently based on whatever they have, whatever service you are owed as a member of the health insurance pool.
But they have to pay for surgery if you have breast cancer. But if you only have a prediction of breast cancer, can you say, well, I want this surgery anyway? I don't have breast cancer.
Oh, for preventive.
Everybody knows I don't have breast cancer, but because I have a risk of getting it, I want to remove my breast tissue.
Oh, that's.
I mean, it seems like there are a lot of public health questions here in terms of I want my child treated for certain problems that the genome says they're going to develop, so I want early intervention.
Well, the thing, my guess is that they won't, and why they wouldn't is that because you don't have it, right?
Exactly. But I mean, people are doing it. It's not even the earlier kinds of testing.
Right, but who's paying for it? Your question is who pays for it, and that this is not really going off on a limb, but they just have what their plan is, and you can do what they let you do at whatever cost. But I think the thing is that they do not discriminate.
I think based on this kind of information, people are going to be lobbying for that to change.
Well, you're describing a case that you want to be discriminated against or for based on your genotype within a health insurance relationship, but right now you can't. I mean, you're describing a case where you might want to, but the problem with that is if you dial it back one is that the insurer would never insure you in the first place if you had this variant, right? They wouldn't want to cover you at all.
That part of the law is going to change. I mean,
Maybe.
It's going to stay the same.
Oh, well.
Yeah, I just think that there are public health questions.
Right. I mean, this is very much wrapped around what we think of as pre-existing conditions, and whether your genetics are a pre-existing condition. Right?
Or was it treatment just experimental, therefore?
Yeah. Yeah, but that's generic in the sense that all decisions have that flavor of what the efficacy of the treatment is and who should pay for those type of treatments. Yeah.
Does anyone know what countries like Canada or Europe does in that situation where a person presents to a doctor and says, "This is my genotype. I want to sign up for the surgery," because it's not an insurer, it's a national health, well, not necessarily, but let's say it's a national health system. I'm wondering what their approach is on that. And it's just a hypothetical to look at different systems where you don't have a for-profit insurer making decisions.
That's right.
Probably be even less likely that, for example, in Canada, because procedures like that are generally speaking limited. That is, they're controlling their costs by limiting treatment in many cases. So I would think Canada.
I mean, something like England, they just have a.
People to know. I'm just thinking it'd be interesting to know.
Well, what I bet would be true is that the evidence that you would need is some sort of trial that says for people with this genotype, this course of treatment actually was better, right? So that there's an actual split on genotype in a trial that said this course of treatment, if you had this genotype, went better than if you had this one. And those studies are emerging often on a molecular, drug A versus drug B case, but for surgery, it wouldn't be impossible. But that's got to be. You're taking this observation that people with this genotype are more likely to develop breast cancer, and then saying, well, because that's true, I should get this surgery. That last part isn't, I'm not sure if there's like a randomized control trial that would tell you that that's true. That because of this genotype, I should get this surgery. That's where I think somewhere like Britain would need, because they just have a line where if something's cost this much per life year, you can get it for free or sponsored, and if it doesn't, you don't. So you need some kind of evidence that what your course you're describing is actually cost effective.
Well, as you mentioned, you have a unique system.
Yes.
American insurance is based on the casino model. It's a cost industry. You can't lose money. They have no incentive of actually playing any costs. Because they make their money on cash flow.
Yeah.
That's how they make their money. But decreasing the number of insurers, the number of things that are insured, that loses them.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, this is more a case by case.
If you're actually an insurance company, you really want to have more people have more insurance and have more money going through.
Well, thank you very much.